long time ago, coupled with some Bible teaching and just paying attention to the things that are going on. Because if we're really serious about Bible prophecy and we really believe that this is the end times, then we ought to be looking at things that are setting the stage. And a lot of people do that. There's some churches that do it, but churches like this, churches like ours are very rare. They're few and far between. There are not many people that are talking about this. And I think it's one of the reasons why maybe for the popularity of the Fellowship Bible Chapel YouTube channel is because we're talking about things that people used to talk about, but don't talk about anymore. I remember in 1967, my father was a pastor in Middle Branch, Ohio, between Canton and Akron, and I have all of his notes. He was very meticulous, organized, kept these little half notebook, typed out sermon outlines for everything that he ever preached, and he put the date on them, like, I did this one on radio, I did this one at this church, so I have all these boxes full of these. I don't know what to do with them, these notebooks down in the basement, but I like the prophecy ones, because in June of 1967, you remember what was going on in June of 1967? Israel was invaded and defeated the Arab armies in a 6-day war. It was a stunning victory. It was miraculous. There's just no other way to describe the things that happened during that war. But my father's notes from that period of time are not typewritten. They're handwritten. They have newspaper clips taped to the page, things that we used to use. We just don't use anymore. And so that's what Dad did. I started doing the prophecy updates about 16 years ago. And it used to be that you could find a couple articles about something that was relevant to Bible prophecy, the way that the world is described as being in the end times. And now it's everything you pick up. It's stunning. There is a convergence of events. I talk about this each week. There's an acceleration and a convergence. And as we get closer to the end, things are going to be going even faster. Things will come out of nowhere. About 2 months ago, I was driving back from my home office in Toledo at a partners meeting, and I decided to take the 4-lane because I actually got off to take the 2-lane road down through the country, through the cornfields home because it's quicker, but I thought, no, I'm going to drive the 4-lane because it's safer. It wasn't 5 minutes after I got back on the 4-lane that some 10-point buck decided to run into the front end of my car, and $14,000 damage. And but if I saw it go up the windshield. I mean, it could have come through the windshield, and I wouldn't even be here talking today. But things happen very quickly. That deer came out of nowhere, and I know that you look at things in the world and you think, where did that come from? How did that happen? How did we get here so quickly? I mentioned in the first hour, a year and a half ago, the Supreme Court said that same-sex marriage was okay. A year and a half ago. Now we have transgender bathroom issues. And what does Facebook have? 47 different gender classifications that you can declare yourself? It's insanity. It's anti-science. They say we're anti-science. They're anti-science because you're a male. You were born a male. You're still a male. And people that talk about that. So these things happen so quickly. It's very difficult. It's very easy to get caught up in the negativity. So I thought I would start off with something funny that somebody sent me yesterday. And on Facebook, of course. And it says, what does a thesaurus eat for breakfast? A synonym roll. Okay. It'll get better. So we're going to talk a little bit about just some of the things going on in the world today. Try to look at them from a biblical perspective. I'll give you a little perspective of the legal aspect. As you know, we elected a new president. We think, right? Everybody's trying to challenge it now. The person who said, they asked Donald Trump, will you accept the results of the election? They never asked her, though, did they? And who's challenging it now? She is. At least we think she is. Or somebody is. Folks, I'm not too worried about it. I think these challenges will fail. They usually do. But they'll keep trying, and it's indicative of the fact that I know there were a lot of people that went through the contentiousness of this election, and a lot of people thought, because I saw them on Facebook posts and whatever, oh, it'll be so nice when the election comes and all this will be over. Folks, it's never ending until Jesus comes. That's the only way this thing gets fixed. And the divisions and problems that you see going on in the world today are only going to increase, and they're going to happen more quickly than you can ever imagine. So now everybody says Donald Trump has to sell everything and get rid of it. Look, and he shouldn't be president. We have this ethics expert, this ethics lawyer says this, and this ethics... Trust me, you can find a lawyer that will pretty much say anything. Sometimes you don't even have to pay them. And it's just the nature of the profession. And I really work hard, and you can pray for me and other Christian lawyers, because we're faced with these ethical conflicts every day. But these things about the president-elect having to sell everything are just nonsense. In fact, there was a post in the... here it is. In the Washington Post the other day, Trump doesn't need a blind trust. So they are never going to stop attacking Donald Trump. And I know that he is not a perfect man. I checked American history. The only people who've ever run for the office of president are flawed people. And so pray for him and pray that he stands strong. I know you had Phil Haney here yesterday, Pastor Brandon, or last week. Pastor Brandon mentioned that in the break between services, he was saying Phil was sort of listing all the things that aren't going to happen that we don't have to deal with now that Donald Trump is president. And it's a long list if you start thinking about the rules on transgender bathrooms in schools, and the list just goes on and on and on. And Phil is a great guy. I'm glad you had him here. I was in Washington, D.C. in May to meet with an expert witness that I had in a case, and I had some extra time, so I called Bill Koenig. I don't know if you know him. You ought to look at his website, watch.org. He's been in the White House as a correspondent since 2000, and he has a weekly newsletter that he puts out about things that are going on. And Bill's been a very good friend of mine for a dozen years. And we get together wherever we can. So I was in D.C. and I said, Bill, why don't we get together? He goes, okay, I'll meet you at the, where's your meeting? He says, let's meet at the Mayflower Hotel, which is a block away. So we got there, and as I went up to see him, he says, some guy my friends want me to meet. I'm not even sure who this guy is. And he'll be here in 10 minutes. So we went out, he called Bill and said, I'm out here on the street. And we went out and got him, went over to a restaurant. Gets out of the car, it was Phil Haney. And I looked at him and I said, I've seen you on TV, on Fox News. But I couldn't place the name. And he goes, well, I saw you on YouTube. And so we got together when he's been in Ohio and coming through a couple times. And in fact, I think I was the one who gave Pastor Brandon his phone number while he was here. So Phil called me a week or so ago and said, hey, we have a mutual friend, Brandon. And I said, well, I gave him your phone number. Oh, well, thanks, amigo. And Phil's a great guy, very humble. And the things that he will talk to you about, though, in private sometimes are just absolutely frightening as to what's going on and what they're letting go on in our government. So a lot of that stuff we don't have to deal with now. This is an interesting development in India. They're having runs on stores. Stores are closing. Nobody's shopping, but there are long lines. People are turning in their cash. And this is the goal. And this is something that Bible prophecy guys have talked about for decades. A cashless society. Here it is. They're doing it in Europe. They're doing it in India, the second most populous country on the planet. They're not going to stop there. They want to get rid of the big bills because they have more control over if you don't have large amounts of cash. Jesus, when and the disciples came to him and talked about things, he described a period of time that would come in the end that says, "And then shall many be offended, and shall betray one another, and shall hate one another. And many false prophets shall rise, and shall deceive many. And because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold." And also in that passage, he says that people are going to be persecuted. And that, I think, is one of the most biggest indicators that we live in the end times, is what I see as the coming persecution of Christians, even in America. I just think it's inevitable. I mean, there are things that I see happening in the legal profession. There was the ABA put in some model rules recently that essentially says you can't make a comment that is considered discriminatory towards transgender people and a bunch of other classifications, even if it's not related to the practice of law. So technically, if this gets adopted, and it probably will be adopted in every state as an ethics code, I could lose my license to practice law if I talk about transgender issues from a biblical perspective. And this is coming, and I think the church needs to start thinking about how we're going to deal with these issues when it comes. But when you I sat here and I watched this week, and because I was on vacation a little bit, I had more time to look at things than I usually do. And so today, we've done at 5. Is that what time we're supposed to be out of here? 5 o'clock. Because the hardest thing I have to do now is to cut down the things that I find that are, I think, important as to the state of the world, the state of the church, and how those fit into Bible prophecy. One of those things that happened this week was the death of Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro was an immoral thug. He was a criminal. He was a terrorist. He was one of the most evil, despicable human beings that we have seen in our lifetime. Somebody said there's a delicious irony about the death of Castro coming on Black Friday. He died on Black Friday, the most capitalist day of the year. But the reaction of world leaders to the death of Castro has been stunning. But there is one exception to how people have reacted. For example, the Pope expressed sorrow over his death. The Catholic Reporter said, Pope Francis on Saturday expressed sorrow over the death of former Cuban leader Fidel Castro, sending a telegram to Castro's brother Raul. Upon receiving the sad news of the death of your dear brother, I express my sentiments of sorrow to your excellency and other family members of the deceased dignitary, as well as to the people of this beloved nation. Francis had met with Castro last year. At the same time, I offer prayers to the Lord for his rest, and I trust the whole Cuban people to the maternal intercession of Our Lady of the Charity of El Cobra, patroness of this country. That man is not a Christian. He is a leftist masquerading as a Christian, making people think that he's a Christian. His religion is leftism. Get it straight. He is not a Christian. There is no lady who is the intercessor for us. There is one intercessor between God and man, the man Christ Jesus. The White House, we should call the White House being the occupied White House right now. Maybe that's what we should call this. At this time of Fidel Castro's passing, we extend the hand of friendship to the Cuban people, President Barack Obama said in a statement. We know that this moment fills Cubans in Cuba and the United States with powerful emotions, recalling the countless ways in which Fidel Castro altered the course of an individual's lives, families, and of the Cuban nation. History will record and judge the enormous impact of this singular figure on the people and the world around him. Good. Just pray that he goes, okay? Really. Enough of this. He is a leftist also. That is his religion. And that's why He identified with Fidel. He identifies with the Pope. It's the nature of the beast. I think it will be the religion in some fashion of the beast, leftism. But we'll see how that plays out. There was one exception to this. Actually, I'll give you one more that was not so. Jeremy Corbyn, who's the leader of the left Labour Party in Britain, said this: "From building a world-class health and education system to Cuba's record of international solidarity abroad, Castro's achievements were many. For all his flaws, he will be remembered both as an internationalist and a champion of social justice." This guy up north in Canada said this: "Fidel Castro was a larger-than-life leader who served his people for almost half a century. A legendary revolutionary in order, Mr. Castro made significant improvements to the education and health care of his island nation. While a controversial figure, both Mr. Castro's supporters and detractors recognize his tremendous dedication and love for the Cuban people, who had a deep and lasting affection for El Comandante. We join the people of Cuba today in mourning the loss of this remarkable leader." That man is, well, I would say he's a moron, but I don't want to insult morons. He really is bad news. He is a leftist also. There was one exception among world leaders that I saw from a president-elect: Fidel Castro is dead, exclamation point. He later issued and MSNBC and CNN are just, their heads are exploding. How can he be so rude at the death? Go read like the New York Post or Today. Just find it online. The immoral things that Fidel Castro did with the many women that he had and all this other stuff. The guy was a murderous, immoral thug. Trump also said this: "We know that..." Whoops. There we go. "Today the world marks the passing of a brutal dictator who oppressed his own people for nearly 6 decades. Fidel Castro's legacy is one of firing squads, theft, unimaginable suffering, poverty, and the denial of fundamental human rights. Through the tragedies, deaths, and pain caused by Fidel Castro cannot be erased. Our administration will do all that it can to ensure the Cuban people can finally begin their journey toward prosperity and liberty." Okay, and now, you know what? I'm on board with that. Okay, I appreciate that somebody is willing to speak the truth for all his flaws. But you should know that one of the supreme examples of somebody who followed the Cuban example is Venezuela. And today from the New York Times we see these articles: "Risking lives to flee ruin. Venezuelans risking lives to escape economic ruin in Venezuela." They're starving to death down there. The socialist communist paradise of Venezuela, of Hugo Chavez, is dying. Here's a picture of a grocery store in Caracas. This one, they said, actually had some food available. They're starving. It's just absolutely terrible. Let's see. Oh, this is interesting. In light of all the problems we have with immigration and everything, this is a report from the Inspector General of the United States that they are missing thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of green cards have been lost. At least 19,000 cards that could be used by people as counterfeit green cards. That's not a good sign. This is something interesting that happened in Israel, and I focus a lot when I talk about the Middle East because that really is the focus of a lot of the end times events. So we'll look at that mostly for the rest of the time, but that has an impact on us in Europe. But the word came in the other day that there were over 200, perhaps 250 fires burning all across Israel. set in many instances by Israeli Arabs, some caused naturally, but most appear to be the work of arson. Greece, Croatia, and Russia sent in planes to help fight the fires. The U.S. has a 747 supertanker that was eventually made its way to Israel when Israel agreed to rent it. Good riddance to the occupied White House. We don't need this anymore. The pictures were heartbreaking. I mean, you live in California, you understand fires and how quickly they can spread and that sort of thing. But this was unusual. Here's some videos of Haifa, the area around Haifa, and some of the fires that were raging. A couple thousand homes destroyed, many more rendered uninhabitable. And Israel's a fairly small country. I mean, you have more people, way more people in California than, probably 4 times as many people in California as they do in the whole of Israel. And it was really heartbreaking for people to see this. Naftali Bennett, who is one of the leaders of the Settler Home Party, he's the education minister in the current cabinet that runs the government excuse me, in Israel, said this: only someone who this land does not belong to would be capable of setting fire to it. Excuse me. You live in a desert, you know that. Naftali Bennett is a great patriot. I'll have some clips of him speaking this week in Jerusalem in just a few moments. And the implication of what Mr. Bennett is saying is that the Palestinian Arabs that live in Israel were the ones who set these fires because they want to burn it down. The land that they supposedly covet so much, they wanted to destroy by fire. And there are a lot of trees in Israel. You can read the reports of Mark Twain and others who went there back in the 1800s and talked about how barren the land was. And what's Israel done since they've been there? They plant trees. In fact, Pastor, have you ever been there? Okay. One of the great things you can do when you go to Israel is go to the Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial. And we were there 5 years ago. And at the end of your tour, you go through this oppressive, all the death, the Holocaust, the executions of the Jewish people under the Nazi regime in World War II. And at the end, you walk through the Hall of Memory, Hall of Remembrance, which is just notebooks, 1 page in each notebook, of the people that died in the Holocaust. And the notebooks hold 3 million pages. There are 3 million they haven't even been able to identify. But then at the end, you walk up this ramp. And when you get to the top, you have this panoramic view of Jerusalem and millions of trees that have been planted. Now they want to burn them down. Arab social media, this is an imam in Kuwait. He wrote this: all the best for the fires. Israel is burning. Another Arab or Muslim activist said this: God is burning their hearts and their homes and their money and their bodies for what they did to the believers. Israel is burning. They were celebrating on Muslim social media that Israel was burning down. One person posted this: yesterday Israel banned the Adhan, the Muslim call to prayer. And Israel today is burning. They said because they broadcast this on social media all around. on loudspeakers all over Israel. If you're there, you hear these very loud, obtrusive things 5 times during the day, the Muslim call to prayer. And so Israel was cutting back on the noise, and now they're saying, well, because you cut back on what the Muslims want, the great Muslim call to prayer, God sent this on you. The interesting thing, they've arrested dozens of young men, mostly Palestinian Arabs, all Palestinian Arabs, for setting these fires. Here's a little graphic of the fires in Israel. You see the Dead Sea, the Sea of Galilee. And it's interesting where these fires are burning. If you look at this other graphic, you see all the fire things. What's not burning? The Palestinian areas. And so this man, Mark Leibowitz, on Twitter said this: remember, this is about 1948, not 1967. Look where the fires are burning. They're burning in the Jewish areas. In fact, you don't even see a fire up near Nazareth, which is a very populous city that's mostly Arab in northern Israel. No fire there. It's Haifa, it's Tel Aviv, it's Jewish areas around Jerusalem. It's about getting rid of the Jews. And it's about time that the world wakes up and realizes this. An Israeli settler leader turned it around and said, no, the fires are divine punishment for planned evacuations of Jews from the settlements. I think that's probably more accurate. But this is not the first time this has happened. A friend of mine on Facebook put this up, and I looked it up. These are old newspaper articles talking about, the first one, and says up there, incendiarism, riots rampant in Holy Land, Arab strike planned, destruction and terror, arson and uprooting, arson, vandalism widespread as Muslims protest Jewish migration. That was published in 1936. So this is not the first time that arson and fires have been used as a way to get rid of the Jews. This in the middle is a poem, and it was written by a man who I believe they found it on him after they found his body. He was hacked to death, a Jewish man hacked to death by an Arab. And here's what it says: plant, sycamores they cut down, cedars we shall plant. This is a poem that he had written. Foes in the open shall never find us scant. The vandal of the desert, destructive is his hand, with faith and fortitude we shall build the land. Onward, onward we shall ever go, pave in the desert paths in spite of foe. Forests are falling, fires are aglare. Plant, 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 brothers, no despair. And here we are 60 years later. No, I'm sorry, 1936, 80 years later. And the same thing is going on. And this continues until the Lord returns. So you just need to get used to it. But you need to understand what is at the heart of it. Well, the UN was up to its usual shenanigans this week. As you know, the UN has issued more resolutions against Israel, the Jewish state of Israel, than all other countries of the planet combined. Little tiny Israel seems to be the focus of the anger and ire of the United Nations. Why? Because it's the land God set aside for a particular people. And so they oppose God. So what the UN did this week was the UN put together not one, not two, not three, not four, 10 resolutions against Israel and the Jewish state. 10 in 1 week. That's good even for them. Here are what they are. First one is UN, well, I won't go through all the numbers, But this is the Special Political and Decolonization Committee, United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian refugees in the Near East. And it says in here, aware of the fact for more than 6 decades, the Palestinian refugees have suffered from the loss of their homes, lands, and means of livelihood. That resolution passed 159 for, 1 against Israel, and 8 abstentions, which included the United States. And the other countries are like Palau and the Micronesia Islands, and they're very little tiny countries. 159 to 1. Next resolution. Persons displaced as a result of the June 1967 and subsequent hostilities. This one, Israel did a little bit better on. It was 156 to 6. Israel, United States, and Canada opposed it, and 6 abstentions. The next one, operations of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East. This one was a little bit different than the other one, 158 to 6, 4 abstentions. I put the flags of the countries in there that abstained or voted against it. Note what's absent. Russia, China, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, all of Europe. Every single country in Europe. Keep that in mind when I tell you I get to the next part. Next resolution reaffirms that Palestinian refugees are entitled to their property and to the income derived therefrom in conformity with the principles of equity and justice. Again, 156 to 6 abstentions. This one, work of the Special Committee to investigate Israeli practices affecting the human rights of the Palestinian people and other Arabs of the occupied territories. This one was a tough one. It only had 86 votes for, 7 against, United States, Canada, and Australia, 71 abstentions. Next one, applicability of the Geneva Convention relative to the protection of civilian persons in the time of war of 12 August 1949 to the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem and the other occupied Arab territories. This one, 155 to 6. Australia abstained. The next one, Israeli settlements in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem and the occupied Syrian Golan. 153 to 6, 7 abstentions. I'm only going through these because I want you to know that they care about everything that goes on in Israel. They did have resolutions about Iraq, Syria, and I believe Iran. 1 for each of those. 10 for Israel. Next one. Israeli practices affecting the human rights of the Palestinian people in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, 151 to 7. Next one. The occupied Syrian Golan, deeply concerned that the Syrian Golan, occupied since 1967, has been under continued Israeli military occupation. That was 153 to 1. Then this one was 155 to 8, permanent sovereignty of the Palestinian people. Mr. Guterres, the new Secretary General of the UN, spoke at a conference in the Vision Europe Summit in Lisbon, Portugal, his home country, this week. The title of it was Improving the Responses to the Migration and Refugee Crisis in Europe. And one of the headlines was, UN boss tells Europe migration unstoppable, says politicians should ignore voters. The incoming Secretary General of the UN told a room of policymakers in Europe on Wednesday that migration is not the problem but the solution, and said that politicians should ignore voters. You know, Romans chapter 1 says that it actually means that God morons the world. But the world is, it's the root word for moron in the Greek. And when you see that happening, these people are insane. He's the Secretary General of the UN. Immigration is the solution. It will destroy the countries. Guterres warned that rich countries were ignoring the losers of globalization by turning to nationalist agendas, as in the U.S. election and Brexit referendum. Guterres told a conference that this trend had undermined the willingness to receive refugees in Europe this year. Gee, do you think why would that happen? He said that the world must reestablish international protection for refugees coming from war zones such as Syria, but it would not be easy as developed countries were turning to nationalist agendas. Actually, here's him speaking.
This is a very dramatic evolution that we had recently. And as this example started in the developed world, it started essentially in Europe, it is spreading now like a virus into other parts of the world, where we are seeing more and more this tendency for borders to be closed and for people even to be sent back in dramatic circumstances that has been happening or being threatened in different of the crisis contexts we have in our world.
This is insanity. France has this was from the New York Times, of candidate's populist flare lifts bid to become the next president of France. A Donald Trump type is what they're saying. And the French are beside themselves as to how this could happen in their country. Coupled with an article just a page or two away, France arrests 5 suspected of plotting imminent terrorist attack. And terror cells are all over Paris. And then in an affluent neighborhood in Paris the other night, they were burning cars. This has been happening for years in Paris. I have friends that live in Lyon, and they told me that cars were burned every night by immigrants. And that if the police come and you describe somebody of African or Arab descent, what do the police do? They get in their car and they leave and don't even take a report. The Gatestone Institute, by the way, there are certain sources that I trust eminently, and the people at Gatestone Institute, these are the people, in my view, that should be getting the Pulitzer Prizes for journalism because of what they're doing. The Gatestone Institute is a must-read, in my view, gatestoneinstitute.org. In an article, Guy Millier writes this: France on the verge of total collapse. Now, I remember we talked about France did not vote against any of those UN resolutions. France has a major immigration problem. And this is a professor at the University of Paris, and he's writing this article. Another one they've written this week, Europe, Let's Self-Destruct. But listen to what he says. I'm going to read a quote from this extensively. France is in turmoil. Migrants arriving from Africa and the Middle East sow disorder and insecurity in many cities. The huge slum commonly known as the jungle of Calais has just been dismantled, but other slums are being created each day. Here's a picture of the organized jungle at Calais. They're near the Channel entrance that goes over to England. In eastern Paris, streets have been covered with corrugated sheets, oilcloth, and disjointed boards. Violence is commonplace. Do you hear this in the mainstream media, by the way? France's 572 no-go zones, officially defined as sensitive urban areas, continue to grow, and police officers who approach them often suffer the consequences. In fact, this is an article from his establishing this back in 2015, Søren Kern, who I believe deserves the Pulitzer more than anyone. European no-go zones, fact or fiction, and he went through and described what those were. But listen to this. Recently, this is back to the article written the other day. Recently, a police car drove into an ambush and was torched while the police were prevented from getting out. If attacked, police officers are told by their superiors to flee rather than retaliate. Many police officers, angry at having to behave like cowards, have organized demonstrations. Intelligence services see that jihadists have returned from the Middle East and are ready to act. and that riots may break out anywhere, anytime, on any pretext. Although overwhelmed by a domestic situation it barely controls, the French government still intervenes in the world affairs. A Palestinian state is its favorite cause, Israel its favorite scapegoat. Last spring, even though both France and the Palestinian territories were in terrible shape, French Foreign Minister Jean-Marc Ayrault anyway declared that it was urgent to relaunch the peace process and create a Palestinian state. France therefore convened an international conference held in Paris on June 3rd. Neither Israel nor the Palestinians were invited to it. The conference was a flop. It concluded with a vapid statement about the imperative necessity to go forward. But France did not stop there. The government then decided to organize a new conference in December, this time with Israel and the Palestinians. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, noting that Israel does not need intermediaries, refused the invitation. Now Donald Trump is the U.S. President-elect, and Newt Gingrich is likely to play a role. Gingrich said a few years ago that there is no such thing as a Palestinian people, and added last week that settlements are in no way an obstacle to peace. As such, the December conference looks like it might be another failure, but keep an eye on it. I think they might try. But France came out and issued rules that they had to label goods made in settlements in Israel. French diplomats nonetheless are working with Palestinian officials on a UN resolution to recognize a Palestinian state inside the 1967 borders, the 1949 armistice lines, but without any peace treaty. My friend Bill Koenig wrote a book called Eye to Eye, Facing the Consequences of Israel, and he detailed in pretty great detail, he detailed quite a number of instances where our government tried to force Israel to divide its land, to enter into a two-state solution, and things happened. Like the perfect storm in 1991 that almost destroyed George W. Bush's home in Kennebunkport, Maine, caused hundreds of thousands of dollars of damage, while President Bush was in Madrid, Spain, trying to force Israel to give up land. We supported the forced evacuation of settlers from Gaza in 2005. Within 72 hours, a little hurricane hit the United States called Katrina. In 2004, there was a hurricane that was going off into the Atlantic, off the east coast of Florida, Hurricane Jeanne. George Bush, President 43, went to the UN, and in his speech, given around noon on that particular day, that Jeanne was going off into the North Atlantic, said there needed to be a two-state solution in the Middle East between Israel and the Palestinians. Jeanne made a complete loop, came back and hit the east coast of Florida. This happens over and over again. I'm only suggesting to you that while France is doing all of this stuff to force Israel to divide the land, its country is burning down. There is a direct connection. They are apparently hoping that outgoing U.S. President Barack Obama will not use the American veto at the Security Council, allowing the passage of the resolution. It is not certain at all that Barack Obama will want to end his presidency in a gesture so openly subversive. Don't bet on it. It is almost certain that France will fail here again, too. And this article goes on. It talks about the history of France. They just did this back in the 50s. They used to be pro-Israel. Then they threw in with the Algerians, and it got worse. Jews are leaving France in record numbers, and these departures do not stop. Sami Gozlan, president of the National Bureau of Vigilance Against Anti-Semitism, repeated for many years that it is better to leave than flee. He was mugged, his car was torched, he left, and now lives in Israel. The rest of the French population clearly sees the extreme seriousness of what is happening. Some of them are angry and in a state of revolt. Others seem resigned to the worst, an Islamist takeover of Europe. The article references this, the French suicide that Eric Zemmour wrote 2 years ago. But listen to this. Now, this is November of 2016. It was November 16th, 2015, that the attack occurred at the Bataclan nightclub in Paris. Just 1 year ago. It doesn't seem like it's been like 2 years ago. 1 year ago. Listen to this. On November 13th, 2016, France marked the first anniversary of the Paris attacks. Plaques were unveiled every place where people were killed. The plaques read, "In memory of the injured and murder victims of the attacks." No mention was made of jihadist barbarity. In the evening, the Bataclan Theater reopened with a concert by Sting. How do you think he closed his concert that night? The last song of the concert was Insha Allah, if Allah wills. God has more on the world. Do you think that this world will resist the Antichrist? I only say this to urge you that I believe time is very short. We've always had false teaching in the church, but it's like everything else, it reaches an apex in the 70th week. And it's getting worse. And I just don't think it's going to get better. And so we need to be about doing God's work with the time that we have left. Europe Let's Self-Destruct is another article at Gatestone this week, just the following day. It says this: ISIS expresses it talks about somebody wanting to be prosecuted for a hate crime in Sweden. They made an anti-Islamic State statement. I'm sorry. They were going to prosecute somebody that was part of ISIS for a hate crime, for inciting people to join ISIS. So they went to the prosecutor, who refused to press charges. Why don't you press charges for a hate crime? You would charge a Christian for making a negative statement about Islam. Why not an Islamic State person? Now I'm going to read his statement. If you can make sense of it, I applaud you. ISIS expresses every kind of disrespect. It is against everyone except those who belong to ISIS itself. There is the dilemma. It offends too big a group. You could say that merely waving the flag of ISIS in the current situation cannot be considered hate speech. It is not an expression of disrespect towards any particular group. It has been said that there could possibly be some form of incitement, that ISIS urges others to commit criminal acts such as murders, but that is not the case. In other words, it's a crime if you insult Islam because that's specific. But ISIS hates everybody, so we can't do anything about them. God is more on the world. I don't know any other explanation. Listen, here's what's coming. Now, I know I'm a little bit short on time, so I'll truncate a little bit of this. They're burning Israel to get rid of the Jews. They're burning cars in Europe to take over Europe. What do you think the judgment God will use to judge them for their evil deeds will be? Do you think it might be fire? In Obadiah, it talks about the prophecy concerning Edom, which I believe to be the Palestinian people. And I will just look at you, and it talks about people occupying the heights and people that, like the eagle, the pride of thine heart hath deceived thee, thou dwellest in the cleft of the rock whose habitation is high. What part of Israel do they live in? The mountains of Israel. Who shall bring me down to the ground? Though thou exalt thyself as the eagle, and though thou set thy nest among the stars, thence will I bring thee down, saith the Lord. What's their symbol, the Palestinian people? The eagle? The eagle? Do you think there's a connection? There's Hillary Clinton and Mahmoud Abbas, and you see the eagle symbol there in the Palestinian symbol. So we know that this prophecy exists against the people of Israel, or against the Edomites. And here is what Obadiah says about that prophecy. Hang on here. For the day of the Lord is near upon all the heathen. As thou hast done, it shall be done unto thee. You burn them, God will destroy you with fire. It's prophesied. For as ye have drunk upon my holy mountain. You see what happened in 586 BC when the Babylonians came in, they cast lots as to who got to burn the temple, God's holy temple. And the lot fell to the Edomites. Later became the Idumeans. King Herod was an Idumean. And some of the Palestinian people today trace their heritage to that. So I'm only going based on what they say. For as ye have drunk upon my holy mountain, so shall all the heathen drink continually. Yea, they shall drink even though they shall swallow down. And they shall be as though they had not been. And it talks about the fact that what is coming for them is fire. Verse 18 of Obadiah. And the house of Jacob shall be a fire, and the house of Joseph a flame, and the house of Esau, the Edomites, for stubble. And they shall kindle in them and devour them, and there shall not be any remaining of the house of Esau, for the Lord hath spoken it. We live at a time when I really think that Israel is at the end of its patience. And I don't know that they will be the agent that will enact this prophecy or not, but I do think this is part of the end time scenario. This may be a trigger event that leads to a Psalm 83 war, Ezekiel 38, 39, but Israel's had it. Israel has had it. They don't want a two-state solution anymore. Here is how much time do I have? 10? The clock seems to be going awfully quick this morning. But in the midst of this, Israel has some optimism. I'm going to... they had a diplomat conference this week. I'll play 2 clips from that. Here is the head of the Israeli Defense Forces talking about what's going on in the Middle East.
Nonetheless, it's not that there is a struggle between 4 forces or main political axes. There is the intervention of global or international community into the Middle East in wider way in the last 2 years. The headed by America coalition against ISIS from one side, and the Russian intervention last year vis-a-vis the Russian regime, mostly in Syria, but in some cases in other areas. So where does Israel stays in all that story? In an almost miraculous way, Israel somehow, in that upheavaled area, is at the eye of the storm and not in the storm.
So Israel is in the eye of the storm, but not really in the storm. Israel is peaceful, is what he's saying. And my fear is that they're being lured into a false sense of peace. There's also this battle going on for Mosul. This is very significant. This is the capital of the Assyrian Empire. This is where ancient Nineveh ruins are located. And what they're finding is that these ISIS people are just so evil in what they're doing. And they wanted all the civilians to stay in Mosul, but now they're asking them to leave. They want them to leave because ISIS is just slaughtering them, so they don't have to worry about them. And they're doing suicide bombings and all this thing. I found this video I wanted to share with you, and I'll probably close with this. It is a drone video of a number of suicide attacks, no sound, in the area of Mosul in Iraq. That's the Euphrates River there. And you're going to see some of these. You'll be able to see, this is pretty, I don't know where they got this stuff, but this is pretty interesting. You see the truck here moving right in through here. You'll see a number of these about how, and they make these, they're like little tanks. They have covers over the wheels. They have bulletproof windows. And they just drive into these neighborhoods and they just blow themselves up. And this is the stories you read. 80 were killed, 136 were killed. This is what happens. Here's one, this is an Abrams tank. Now the tank actually came out pretty well on this one, so that ought to be some comfort. Here's another one, shows them from different angles. And what they do is they try to get into these compounds where the military people are. So here you see, there it goes. You can see they have a tag on it. And these are people who are just blowing themselves up. I think there's one more here. You see the target there in red. Boom. And every time you see this, I had a video of a close-up of soldiers that they had just walked out into this courtyard, similar to what you see there, 5 of them dead instantly. The 5 you'd seen walk out there, they were all killed. And this happens over and over, day after day after day, sometimes multiple times a day. These powerful explosions all over Iraq and Syria. It's unbelievable. So, we live in a very upsetting world. At the time all that's going on, Turkey is raising its head. Erdogan has become a dictator. Russia, or the EU, doesn't want them in anymore. They've suspended talks. So what did Erdogan come out and say? You don't want us in the EU? I'll tell you what I'll do. I'm going to let all the migrants come through Turkey like I used to. We'll see how you deal with that. Jihad by immigration. I think Phil talked about that. So I could go on and on and on and on for hours. And here's the takeaway. We live at a momentous time. God is issuing us clarion calls to action, to get our lives right, and to reach out to those around us with the gospel. It's time that the church be faithful and righteous and share their faith. It's really time. And I just pray that you all will be faithful. I pray that you would pray for us at Fellowship Bible Chapel, that we will remain faithful in the time that we have left. It may be a while, I could be wrong, but things are just happening way too quickly these days. And so I would pray, my prayer for this church would be that you stand faithful to the end.